Hi, how are you? I'm a bit jet lagged, so I'm just remembering how all this works. But I think I'm good. I was in Canada. I flew back from Canada yesterday. I live in the UK. So my brain's a bit wobbly, but we're going to look at sections of skin, hairy skin, because that's the interesting skin, and most of our skin is hairy. We're going to look at this under the microscope, and this is a classic bit of histology. I remember teaching this and being taught this 30 years ago. And sure, it's an epithelium, but there are also lots of interesting things in here like hair follicles and sebaceous glands and sweat glands, and we should be able to see all of that. Of course, the famous pub quiz question is about the largest organ in the body. It's the skin, the integumentary system. It's our barrier to the outside world. It's a waterproof layer. It keeps all of our stuff in, keeps our water in, which is really important. This is why burns are dangerous, is because you lose a lot of fluid. Keeps the outside world stuff out. It's involved in thermoregulation. Talks about those hairs, so the hairs can keep you warm. Not that useful in humans, but more useful in other animals. It produces sweat to cool you down, produces, like I say, sebum and oil to protect the skin and the hair. It's full of sensors, so we can detect the outside world. And most of the skin is still hairy, even though the hairs are very fine. It's the palms and the soles of the feet which have thick skin and not hairy skin, because of the, walking on the soles of your feet and gripping things with your hands, right? Whereas I think the rest of the skin is hairy. I think this says human scalp, so this should be nice and hairy, right? So there are two main layers. There's the epidermis and the dermis. We occasionally talk about the hypodermis, but the epidermis is the epithelial covering, and the dermis is the connective tissue support, which is also full of blood vessels and nerves, and that's where we find the hair follicles and the glands and stuff. All right, okay, yeah, look at that. So this is a nice modern section. So the connective tissue is in green. The epithelium there we can see at the interface with the world. And we can see these strange shapes. So these are going to be the hair follicles. Depending upon the plane of section, that affects exactly what we see. We can see very glandular structures here. Now, some of those glands are attached to the hair follicles, and some of them, well, that one's near the hair follicle and will be attached. We just can't see it because it's kind of out of this plane of section. But we're seeing other glands here, which are separate to the hair follicle, and as we go deeper we get to fat and what have you. That's what the hypodermis would be the fat layer, whereas the green bit, that's your dermis, and then we've got the epidermis on top there. So what are we looking at? We should start from the surface and work our way down, I think. Okay, so this is at my lowest power objective lens. This is a 4 times objective lens, 10 times to my eye, so 40 times magnification for me, but that'll vary a little bit depending upon the size of the screen you're looking at this on. Let's then jump up to, there's 10 times, well, 100 times magnification. Let's go a bit higher. Now this is why this is called thin skin. It's because this epithelium is thin. So that's what we're looking at there. There's the epithelium, and you can see layers of cells. So this is an epithelium. There are multiple layers, so that means it's a stratified epithelium. And the cells here are flat, or will be when they've finished appearing. So it's a stratified squamous epithelium, and those wiggly bits we're seeing on the surface there are keratinized epithelium. So the cells start off as living cells. So we've got a number of layers. As I move around, you can see that This is a thin layer all the way. I mean, this is a pretty thin layer as the epidermis, the outermost covering of your body, right? The thing that's exposed to the outside world. So the outermost layer then is the stratum corneum. The stratum corneum are those keratinized cells that are going to get lost. The purple line you can see there, that's the stratum granulosum. So that's where the cells are becoming granular, filled with granules. That's where they're changing and becoming keratinocytes. And then the layer deep to that is the stratum spinosum. And the stratum spinosum is the cells moving from the stratum basale. If the stratum basale are the cells at the lowest part of the epithelium, the progenitor cells, the stratum spinosum, stratum basale cells become stratum spinosum, become stratum granulosum, become stratum corneum. And in terms of skin cancer, exposure of the skin to ultraviolet light damages DNA, damages the protection mechanisms by which these cells go through these changes, and squamous cell carcinomas most commonly form from the stratum spinosum layer of cells, and basal cell carcinomas form from the cells in the stratum basale, the basal layer. And these cells are at slightly different stages. We talked about progenitor cells, which means they form slightly different cancers with slightly different risks and characteristics. Carcinoma, because they're forming from an epithelium. Now, for one, if I just slide across, if we look at this layer, if I get, there we go, there's a good section. If I get across to a hair follicle, you can see how that epithelium continues in. So it's a continuous layer down into the hair follicle. And we'll look at the hair follicle in more detail as we go deeper. But what I should do is say that this is thin skin. This is the skin that covers most of your body. This is hairy skin. Now, if I take that out very carefully and put in a layer of thick skin, this is the skin that you see on palms of your hands, soles of your feet. You can see why it's called thick skin. That's the epithelium again there, look. So you've got the same layers, but look, you've got a whacking thick stratum corneum, and then you can see that purple stratum granulosum. Wow, that looks great. And then the stratum spinosum and stratum basale. Isn't that cool? Now, if I actually go to a wider power, okay, so if I slide across from one side of the slide to the other, what's the other thing that we notice about thick skin? We aren't seeing any hair follicles because you don't have hair on the palms of your hands or the soles of your feet. You do still have sweat glands and all the other bits and bobs, but no hair follicles. So that's thick skin, and this is us back on the thin skin. So that's what we mean by thick and thin skin. All right, back up to 200 times magnification. All right, so that's the epidermis done. That's the epidermis. Then as we go deeper, we're looking at the dermis. So the dermis is mostly green here because the dermis is filled with collagen fibers. It's the structural supporting layer. This is the thick bit of your skin. But can you see, okay, there's a few features here. Can you see these folds? And let's see if we can find some other ones. See how there's quite a few of these indents? These are dermal papillae. So these dermal papillae, these folds, create a stronger junction between the epidermis and the dermis than if you didn't have them. So, and often if you get blisters, again, we're really thinking about thick skin and thin skin when you get most blisters, it's often between the dermis and the epidermis layers, and you get fluid caught between the two layers, and they separate the two layers and you get that bubble of fluid. That's your blister. But these are dermal papillae, so these are new. And something else I saw here, I'm guessing that, so these circles that we're seeing here in the epidermis, I'm guessing that these are sweat glands opening into the skin. So sweat glands, if I dive down deep, let's see what we can see. So we can see lots of blood vessels, like we can see thin walled blood vessels like we see in the middle there, and we see some thicker walled blood vessels. So we've got arterioles and venules. Here we go. But that looks different, right? That's a gland. Looks nice and glandular. That's your sweat gland, and most of the body is covered in eccrine sweat glands. We also get apocrine sweat glands in places like the axilla and the groin, and they release kind of different smells and what have you, mammal things. But these eccrine sweat glands here, these are the sweat glands that cover most of the body, and they produce a serous secretion with just the right amount of salts in them, and this is sweat. So these sweat glands are coiled tubular glands. There's some good ones. These are coiled tubular glands, so they're epithelial glands. And again, these are continuations of the epithelium with the surface. But these epithelial cells are forming ducts and are forming, secretory cells around a tube. But I can also see in red, this is quite nice. I can see myoepithelial cells. So I can see epithelial cells which have also got smooth muscle in them around the cells of the gland. So these myoepithelial cells can squeeze the gland, squeeze the secretions into the duct and up and out onto the surface of the skin. That's very nice. So eccrine sweat glands. Now that's different to the sebaceous glands. Oh, look, see? That looks completely different, right? There's your sweat gland, and there's a sebaceous gland. This looks quite different because it's producing an oily secretion. So these cells look like they're filled with fat and other bits and bobs, right? And actually, if I follow that up, this is a good one. We can see that it is part of, connected to the hair follicle, and we can see one on the other side as well. Let me bump out to a lower power. See? So the sebaceous glands then are going to secrete their oils into the hair follicle, onto the hair, and the hair will then take it out onto the skin. So this sebaceous gland is protecting the skin, stopping it from drying out, making you nice and oily, and making your hair nice and oily too. We can see some of the remnants of the hair inside the follicle there, but you can see the cells supporting the hair follicle, and like I said, that's a continuation of the epithelium of the epidermis. Okay. So let's follow that hair follicle down. Look, it goes quite a long way. And now we're getting down to, well, okay, there's a change in section there, which is why it's looking different. But as we get down to the bottom of the hair follicle, now we're seeing the bulb of the hair follicle. So these are the cells that are producing the hair. This is the bulb. And you see that indent down there. That indent is also called a dermal papilla. So that indent into the bulb is where the capillaries, where the blood vessels are entering and supplying all these cells down here with, with blood, with oxygen and nutrients, right? So here's the hair bulb, responsible for growing all this hair. And we can just about make out some tiny little capillaries in there, tiny little circles with some tiny little red blood cells in there. Remember that capillaries can get so small that a red blood cell can just squeeze down it. So these are very, very small vessels. But isn't that a nice feature? I don't know, it's something about hair follicles, they're kind of cool. Now, The other thing I'd really like to see, so if we just slide across, we'll see lots of sweat glands, we'll see lots of hair follicles, we'll kind of just see this repeating structure. This is very hairy skin. We've got lots of hair here. Like I say, this is from scalp. We'll see the same pattern repeating as we go through. But what I'd like to see are some sensors. Now, what we got there is we've got two blood vessels. We've got a thick walled blood vessel, so an arteriole, thin walled blood vessel, so a venule, and we've got a nerve in between by the looks of it. All right? Because if you've been watching a lot of these videos, hopefully you're getting used to looking at these things. So we've got thin endothelial cells lining that. We can see loads of blood cells in there. We can see, we can see some thicker walls there, but also endothelial cells, and we can see something that looks a bit different there. But in the dermis is where we'll also find those sensors. Now, I know I've seen these before, but I can't remember on what section. But what I'm really looking for is a Pacinian corpuscle. Pacinian corpuscles are cool. They detect pressure and vibration, and they look like, well, onions. I can't find any. I know I've seen one somewhere. Was it on a section of the bladder, maybe? I'll dig it out in a minute. Anyway, the other thing we have to, of course, the other thing we have to talk about that I almost forgot, because they're not super striking on this section, but your hairs can stand up on end, right? You can get goosebumps. You can, you know, make your hair stand on end to make yourself look bigger, or to keep yourself warmer. Like I say, that applies probably to hairier animals, but that there is the arrector pili muscle running to that bit of a hair follicle that you can see there. If we slide across, can you see there's a bit of a hair follicle there, there's a bit of a hair follicle there, and there we can see two arrector pili muscles running to those hair follicles. So the arrector pili muscles are the muscles responsible. They stabilize the hair, they pull on the base of the hair, so as they pull on it, they pull the hair upright. These are innervated by autonomic nerves, they're innervated by the sympathetic nervous system. You know, adrenaline, fight or flight, and your hair stand up on end, goosebumps, right? So again, is this a better one? Maybe. So there's the hair follicle going into the dermis, and over there to the right is the smooth muscle of the arrector pili muscle. Yeah, cool. You know, it depends on the plane of section as to how cool that looks. Okay, here's a section of bladder. If I do find one here, my memory is better than I think it is. Yeah, look, there we go. Look at that. So yeah, we're looking at bladder now, but the structure also exists in the skin. It's the same principle. Do you see those layers? Like an onion. That is your Pacinian corpuscle. And in the centre there, you have a modified neuron, and all those layers mean that, you know, you push on the layers and they compress the centre bit, and it generates action potentials, and you feel pressure. That is the Pacinian corpuscle that you find in the skin that I couldn't find in the skin, but I think worth looking at because that is a cool structure. Okay, so to finish up, let's go back to the skin. Right, so we have looked at the skin. you're aware of the epidermis and the dermis and the hypodermis. The dermis itself is actually divided into a papillary layer, so that's the bit of the dermis closest to the epidermis, and the rest of it is the reticular layer. Reticular just refers to collagen fibres everywhere. And in the epidermis, we talked about how it's a stratified squamous keratinized epithelium with that stratum corneum at the surface that gets lost, the stratum granulosum being kind of the purple line, the stratum spinosum being the cells working their way up to that line, and the stratum basale being the progenitor cell layer at the base. We talked about those dermal papillae, those dermal papillae anchoring the epidermis to the dermis, and the dermis is filled with connective tissue. And we saw sweat glands, which are epithelial glands that duct onto the surface of the skin, and we saw sebaceous glands that duct into the hair follicles, and the hair follicle produces hair that grows out to the skin. We talked about the bulb of the hair follicle down in the base, and we saw the arrector pili muscles, the smooth muscle that can give you goosebumps and lift your hair follicles up. And that is the histological structure of the skin, the cellular structure of the skin, the microscopic structure of the skin, and that's how skin works. I did a while ago a video about the skin, but I used a plastic model. Here we're looking at actual cells, actual structure, actual molecules. Anywho, hope that was useful. Hairy skin. See you next week.